we did talk last week. We're in this great series and so excited about what the creative team did with this video. We're talking about this idea that we need to see other people. And last week, if you weren't with us, I talked about my infatuation with bonsai trees and unique succulent plants and this really cool nursery in Anaconda. And so some friends last weekend actually went and visited this place. And I told them, one of the guys was like, doesn't care about plants, but I was like, okay, so here's the deal. There's this cat there. So the guy who owns this place is iconic. I mean, he looks like Jerry Garcia. He's got this long gray hair, and he combs it straight back, and it comes down to his waist, and he listened to rock and roll music, and there's cigarette butts everywhere inside of this place. It's just this really cool place. Well, I told my friend who doesn't like plants, I was like, well, there's this cat there who has 4 legs but only 3 paws. So it's not actually missing a whole leg, it's just missing a paw. So I said, you got to see this cat. So he got there, and he went up to the guy, and he said, hey, do you have a cat that has 3 legs or 4 legs but only 3 paws? And the guy said, yeah. And he said, well, where is he? And the guy said, well, he's not here right now. And my friend was like, well, that's strange. Where is he? And he said, he's out looking for his father. Takes a second, because he's missing his paw. So he's looking for his father. So that's the kind of place this place is. You should go check it out. The question that we started with last week was this question of what if the healthiest people you know are people who do things tired with other people? And what I'm trying to explore in this series, it's really not a deconstruction of our response to COVID. That's not my agenda. I'm pretty ambivalent on all those things. I respect that some of us are cautious and some of us are accepting, and I think there's room to apply this within both of those kind of extremes, so to speak. But really what I want to get us thinking about is what if COVID and what if all of this is giving us a chance to really rethink the essential nature and the essential need for connection with others? That really what I'm trying to do is go, okay, so if we allow that food and water and shelter and sleep are essential parts of what it means to be human, I would add God into that mix, that then can we also begin to have this conversation around to what degree are our people essential? And again, if you're among the cautious for good for you, there's chances to nuance that within that. And if you're the accepting, then I think this is probably easier. But my agenda is to go, what if we have to think a little bit differently about the way we think about our need for connection? What is that? Is that my phone? Oh, hey, Bob. Good job, you brought your phone. So when I say that out loud, there's part of me that thinks that I wonder how many of you do what I do, and that's this thing where I go, but I'm an introvert. So to whatever degree this applies, it doesn't apply to me because I'm that type of person who gets drained by being around people. And it just jogged my memory this week. One of the most helpful books I ever read, and it's been a while, was this book by Susan Cain called Quiet. You may have heard of it. This is one of those books where if you just punch her into your podcast app, you can read the book, it's good, but she gives a lot of stuff away in some good interviews. She's a great interview. But her thesis in this book is that culturally we've messed up the definition of what constitutes an introvert and an extrovert. Her argument is that we say it's about, well, an introvert would say, people drain me, and an extrovert would say, people energize me, and she says that's not actually the dynamic and how it happens. Her argument, and there's some science in there, she cites a longitudinal study that followed infants all the way into their 20s, but her hypothesis, I guess, is that it's less about people know people, and it's more about stimulation. That her definition of an introvert is introverts don't do high stimulation well. It's why CEOs and managers and teachers and things like that, bosses tend to be introverts, because us introverts, we have to be in control of our environment because we don't do stimulation well. Extroverts, on the other hand, they thrive. They thrive on new things coming at them and new challenges and unexpected questions. And so what she's saying is that we do well to understand these dynamics. In fact, with the babies, they took these infants and they exposed them to, I think it was the sound of a popping balloon, a really pungent smell, and then they would take these newborns and rub their finger across the bottom of their foot, which of course irritates the heck out of most babies. And what they observed was that some babies had this very negative response, and others were kind of unaffected by it. And she hypothesized that those who were deeply impacted by that would become introverts because they don't do stimulation well, and vice versa. And her longitudinal study suggests that she's actually accurate. Using myself as an example, I've had to learn, like, people energize me, but new people or lots of people or hanging out with people in new places, it's not that I don't value that, it's that it is by definition draining. But familiar people in familiar places, that can still be energizing. If I go on a mountain biking ride on a trail I've never been on, I can enjoy that, but it is exhausting. If I go on a trail that I've been on 100 times, it's cathartic. And so before you check out and go like, yeah, I've already figured this out, I'm an introvert, I don't need people, I guess I would challenge you to maybe even check out her book and go, wait a minute, maybe it happens differently than we've commonly accepted. Which leads me to the second question, and that is, and here's where I really want to dive in, what if disconnectedness often goes undiagnosed or even misdiagnosed? Which is a way of saying maybe your job isn't as bad as you think. Like maybe your job's not the problem, but maybe you've diagnosed your job's the problem when the bigger problem is you're really disconnected outside of your job and you're therefore asking your coworkers to do things for you that maybe they can't. Maybe your roommate or your partner or your spouse, like maybe your marriage isn't as bad as you've concluded. Maybe you're trying to fill too much connection need from one relationship. And listen, the last thing I want to do this morning is in any way call question to clinical depression and anxiety and those things. But what if on some level, what we often call some of those clinical things are actually the symptom of a culture that has more or less insisted over recent years to live life in isolation? I remember studying in grad school the single-family dwelling and how unique it is to the human scene, and I've had several conversations with especially new moms in recent years because of that, where there's this shame that comes from not being, like, for those that aren't totally satisfied being a stay-at-home mom, and this realization that I learned in grad school was, wait a minute, at best, the life you're trying to live is historically unprecedented. Just as early as the 40s, people didn't live with the kind of isolation that we live with. So the question becomes, what if we miss it? And Dr. Larry Crabb, you may or may not be familiar with him. He's a Christian psychologist who really came on the scene in the 90s. He was one of the first guys that I know of who was reputable in the academic and in the treatment side, but also was very open about the fact that he was a Christ follower with a Christ-following worldview. And he had great popularity in the kind of Christian celebrity speaking circuit in the 90s. And then in 1997, he published a book called Connecting. We have a few copies of it out at the table. It's this exceptional book in my view. But before he released the book, his colleagues told him that if he did, he would be committing what they called professional suicide. And the reason they said that is because his observation of life from doing treatment for quite some time was that if people understood better what connectedness could bring to their life, then people like him who make their living doing therapy would have less work to do. And again, the last thing he's saying is there's no place for the therapeutic or the clinical or the psychological. He's not saying that, but he's just simply arguing that a lot of people who end up in need of these services are actually there because they're disconnected. In fact, from his own words, here's the way he says it, and you can read it and check it out for yourself, but he says this: connected community, not good advice, not deeper insight, is at the center of things. Beneath what our culture calls psychological disorder is a soul crying out for what only community can provide. The problem beneath our struggles is a disconnected soul. The reason why it feels like the perfect time to have this conversation is, to whatever degree he's accurate, it's probably not lost on you that to whatever degree he's accurate, it's exponentially more accurate right now. And what if he's right? What if you're not as broken as you might think? What if you're just lonely? I have a special amount of empathy, and I've had conversations with those of you couples who, like, you're on a different page on this one. And I've had multiple conversations with people where there's this suffering because even you are on two different pages, so you can't even agree on what it looks like to be connected. And I think that's not the end of the world, but that creates all the more need for very serious conversation. And listen, I'm not a scientist, and I have great respect for therapists, but like many of you, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand from the text, who is this God? What is this God like? What does it mean to be human? And part of what stands out to me from Crabb's observation is this: we often celebrate this doctrine that many times we don't even know what it means, the doctrine of the Trinity. And I can't claim to be able to understand it very well. William Paul Young's book, The Shack, was really helpful to me. But to the degree that I do understand it, the part that I understand is that God, by his very nature of being triune, is in relationship with God's self, which is kind of strange. But part of what's unique then about Christian creation theology is that God didn't create out of a sense of loneliness or need, that God is connected within God's self, and that God is inviting people into community. Listen to Genesis 1, and I don't think the original authors were thinking about the Trinity when they wrote this, but this is the type of passage that caused theologians after Jesus died and was resurrected to go like, wait a minute, there's this thing. Listen to 1:26. Then God said, listen to the plural nature of this. It's wild. Let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. What if at the core of what it means to be human is made for relationship and connection? We looked last week at Genesis 2:18, where within this story, God has this person, Adam, and we can trip up over how literal is this, and that's really not, for me, the conversation right here. I'm not convinced that's what Genesis has in mind, but what's going on here? And God says to Adam, then the Lord said, it is not good that man should be alone. So whatever we can conclude about the age of the earth and evolution and all that, there's this fundamental observation, and that is that people, like a person and the God, according to the scripture, is not enough. Like humanness is incomplete in that place. Paul in Galatians, and this one, I had a friend in my early days of following Jesus. I think this is why we work so hard to define being a Christian as serving people together. Paul in Galatians 6 says this, bear one another's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. If you slow down, that is a massive claim. Like, was there like 1,093 or something like that commands in the Old Testament, 600 and some in the New Testament? Paul's saying all of that. You can fulfill all of that. How? By living in this mutually dependent, cooperative, serving one another, bear one another's burdens community. What if we're designed to be connected? And what if we live in a culture that, quite frankly, challenges that to a very high degree? I have a friend, and I asked his permission to tell this story. He's this legendary guy. He's in his 70s now, I think. In his younger years, he taught, I think it was in like Pine Hills or something like that, the type of school where kids were sentenced to the school. They would go to prison if they were of legal age, but because they're not, they go to this school. And he taught there. And this guy is super likable and very jovial. So I wasn't surprised when he told me that he was very well liked by the other students and had great relationship with them. He said, but there was one student. He said, in hindsight, the student was kind of goofy looking. He didn't like the student didn't like him, the other students didn't like him. He was really disruptive, and he said, in fact, sometimes he'd be in the middle of a lecture, and this student would just start cussing him out, and then that got disruptive because these other kids who could take care of themselves would rise up to defend my friend, and there'd be this altercation, and it just wasn't a good thing. And he didn't necessarily think a lot about it. It was just the one disruptor in that part of his career. Well, years later, he was volunteering in Deer Lodge, which, again, like that's the type of guy this guy is, like lost me there. Good on him. He was walking through the courtyard, actually. It was like, seriously? He said there was a break, and so I just went on a walk through the courtyard of the prison. Probably can't do this anymore. And he said I was hanging out there, and this kid, who's not a kid anymore, he's a man, came up to him. And he recognized him right away, goofy-looking guy, apparently had a really long neck or something. And the guy just came up to him, and he said, hey, when I get out of here, I'm going to kill you. And my friend's like, jeez. He said, well, here's the deal. I've told a lot of people about you, so if anything happens to me, people know who to go looking for. And then the guy looked at my friend and he just said this. He said, well, you never liked me. And my friend said it was weeks before he put it all together and understood what was going on there. What if some of our most complicated problems are tied to our disconnectedness? And what if we do well to pay attention to those dynamics? See, Crabb says there's three things that make real connection really work. Three cultures, if you will, that have to be in place. And I'm not claiming to be good at any of them. I think this is what makes life and real relationship and parenting and all these things so difficult. But the first thing he says is this, that healthy connection gives us a taste of Christ delighting in us. We know this. We know when we fail to do this as parents and leaders and friends, and we know when someone's doing this for us. It's a reminder that the Jesus story is not a three-part story. It's not fall and then redemption and then restoration. That the story, there's 4 chapters, if you will. It starts with a God who created and delights in God's creation. And part of what I love about Dallas Willard's Divine Conspiracy book is he does such a good job of saying God delights in creation, that the world is a perfectly safe place for us to be, that God delights in sunrises more than any of us ever could, that humans aren't the only thing about creation that God cares about. He loves creation. That I'm rereading some mystic Christianity stuff recently, working on some meditation stuff and some stuff we'll work on in January, but Cynthia Bourgeau reminded me, Genesis 1:31, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. One of the conversations we're going to have in February is like this, the power of bad in our negative culture, and how do we step into a God who looks out and goes, it is good, who's not naive to the brokenness and sin and all those dynamics, but delights in. This is Christ, and to whatever degree you're connected with him, this is probably why, because when you read about the leper that he touched or the prostitute woman that he gave dignity to, you identify with feeling unlikable and just this sense that God likes you. Years ago, I worked with a coach who said the fundamental refrain in all of our heads is, if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me. What if healthy connection, first and foremost, affirms that despite ourself, we're likable? The second thing he adds is this diligent search for what is good. That healthy connection, it starts from this place, and this is what I love about spiritual direction and chaplaincy and some of those practices, is it starts with just affirming, where is God, where is good in your story? Let's not start with the negative, let's start with the positive. And yes, number 3, there is this exposure to what's bad, but to what's painful, an engaging exposure of what is bad or painful, he says. But I don't know about you. I tend to make number 3 number 1, and number 2 and number 3 and number 4 and number 5 and number 6. And every once in a while, I'll get to number 1. What if at the core you're made to be connected, and to fail to be so leads to all kinds of weird, almost unintuitive kind of response? Now, I asked my son permission to share this one, but this last spring, we were doing some baseball work during quarantine, and my middle son, Chase, there was a moment where he just said his hip popped. And I was kind of like, yeah, you're just lazy, sitting around in quarantine, nothing's wrong with your hip. I wasn't very sympathetic, frankly. And then as the season finally started, we didn't even know if there was going to be a baseball season, he started to play, and my just pessimism towards his hip injury proved that no, it was persistent, it was there. And then it would kind of start to go away, and then all of a sudden his shoulder hurt, and then his elbow hurt, and then they didn't hurt, and his hip hurt again, and it was just, injuries are frustrating. You know this if you've ever been through it, and I learned a lot as a parent of walking through a kid with injury. And so finally we started working with this really great physical therapist who's involved with the Legion program, I think Dr. Bennett, and he, I don't know, I guess he's not a doctor. I don't know how, whatever, you know what I'm saying. So we went and saw him, and he was giving Chase some exercises, some for the hip, some for the shoulder, and Chase was doing the work. And then finally there was this point where he was like, I tell you what, you should probably go to Dr. Michelotti's, you should go to his clinic and get an x-ray and just eliminate that there's anything physical going on. Because the conversation that started was, is this a pain issue or is there something else going on? So we went there, and it was after hours, and he got this x-ray, and there was this helpful gal, and she read it, and she's like, best I can tell, you're okay to keep playing, but he'll probably call you, he's probably going to want to see you. I had no idea that you'd be here this morning, by the way, doctor, so it's good to see you. So a few days later, he called, hey, I want to see Chase, and I said this the first service, so it's not platitudes, but very quickly when Chase got into your office, his office, I learned why Dr. Michelotti is so respected in our community, in our region. Because as a parent, you're always looking for adults who will treat your kids like humans, and he engaged Chase. His bedside manner was quite awesome. And because of what my wife does, I hear her talk about different doctors and their skills and this ability, and they were just kind of talking about life and then the injuries. And then finally he pulled up the x-ray, and he's like, okay, so here's the deal, Chase. And he explained to him, here's what happened. Maybe it was because you grew so fast, so quickly. But basically, yes, one of the tendons or ligaments, I don't even know which, because I study the Bible, not science, which maybe is an indictment. It pulled away some of the bone, so that's what you're feeling. But the good news is you can play through it. You're not going to hurt anything any worse. And then he said, but here's the good news. He said, you don't have 2 or 3 injuries. Because remember, Chase was dealing with a hip and a shoulder and an elbow. He said, actually, you only have 1 injury. That what happened was you had a hip injury, that then your shoulder started compensating for that injury, and then your elbow started compensating for that. And so the good news is, as the hip heals, so will those other things, which was great news because Chase was having these conversations about changing his throwing mechanics and all these things, and we were assuming he had 2 or 3 injuries. My point is just this. What if this is you? What if this is me? What if at the core of our struggle, and I think this is, to whatever degree it's true, it's especially true right now, is there's this commitment to doing life alone that frankly is unprecedented in the human scene. I think one of the things I've learned just walking with people, I have a friend who's always advocating for like Catholic confession practices, and I've experienced that in quarantine. Like sometimes a person just needs to say to another person, like, here's all the ways that I've been misbehaving, and there's like something therapeutic about the confession of that. You know, I've been thinking about this in the context of the manna, because the older I get, the more that manna metaphor in the Bible makes sense. And you may not be familiar, but there's this moment when Moses leads Israel out of Egypt, and suddenly they're in the wilderness, and they're like, wait a minute, we didn't bring any Mountain Dew with us. What are we going to eat? And the text says this, "Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out," and watch these words, "and gather enough for that day." Now again, if you want to talk about the nuances of this, I'd love to go for a walk and talk about how to the manna. There's some interesting theories out there about how this actually did happen. But the wisdom of it, to me, is even more valuable. William Paul Young, I remember when he was here, he said, we've got to learn to live within the grace of the day. And to me, what holds so true about the manna, Jesus talked about, Lord, give us today our daily bread. Don't worry about tomorrow. It's got enough worries of its own, elsewhere is said. That what we know is that there's many things in life that are essential to our thriving, but what's kind of frustrating is there's no permanent solution. Remember when the original Willy Wonkas came out and there was that everlasting gobstopper? Maybe you're like me as a kid and you're like, man, I want to get one of those. But what we know is no matter how hungry you are, if you feed your body a really healthy meal, you can't expect that to carry you for more than a day, and in many cases, a few hours. And if we identify that we're really thirsty, you know, a great glass of water on the sideline of a football field, or a great drink of water on the sideline of a football field, then that's refreshing, but nobody expects that to be the only time for the next week that they have to drink something. And I wonder if we do well to think of connection and relationship in this way. My friend Fred used to say to couples who were married, listen, if you'd have told your spouse before you got married that you wouldn't go on any more dates once you got married, they wouldn't have married you. Like, we know. We know that so many things have to happen a lot. What if that's the way to think about connection? And what if the trouble is we go looking for permanent substitutes when there is no permanent substitute? We need people. You know, before the last service, or during it actually, I had an interaction I've never had before, and Justin sidled up next to me, and he manages all the online stream stuff and does a great job of watching it and making sure everything's working, and he sidled up next to me back there in the soundboard during what was, I think, the first song, and he's like, hey, we're getting lit up on Facebook. And as soon as he said it, I knew exactly why that was the case, because when I put together these series, I try to be honest about how am I thinking about this, how am I learning this, how am I processing this, and I always have what I call my back office titles. And then when it comes time to actually deliver content, those almost always get changed. But on this one, my back office title was better than masturbation. And that's crass, I get it. But here's my point. Statistically speaking, 75% of the people in this room looked at pornography this week. And I'm not here to judge that, but to point out that by definition, what pornography and masturbation is it's a cheap substitute for the real thing. That in the absence of real vulnerable relationship and real commitment, we're self-gratifying a desire. And I wonder if that metaphor doesn't roll over into the way we think about other things. Listen, if you get thirsty and you drink a Coke, The good news is you'll kind of appease your thirst, but what we know is you won't really satisfy your thirst. It's like a cheap substitute. If every time you're hungry, you go to the McDonald's drive-thru, the good news is you won't be hungry anymore. But what we know is you're robbing your body of what it really needs. I wonder if that's true with the way we often are engaging in connection. And I know that's crass. I hope I have the credibility to play that card because I don't play it very often. But I think there's something to really think about here. And that would be this. What if we feed our need for connection by jumping on Facebook? And I'm not here to just carte blanche judge Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or texting or any of those things, but what if one of the real dangers is we get these cravings, and rather than doing the harder work of fulfilling them in real healthy ways, we give ourselves the equivalent of masturbation, of a Coke, when what we need is a glass of water, of a bunch of fries, and what we need is a salad. What if, and this is where I'm thinking back to Cal Newport and some of the work that we did last February in that Save Me From My Cell Phone series. What if there's a real danger to sitting in your chair at 7 o'clock at night, feeling lonely and turning to Facebook? Because I guess what I'm wondering, and Cal Newport suggests it is the danger of that is that's what keeps you from calling up a friend and having a phone conversation. That's what keeps you from walking outside and having a fire with your neighbor. That there's these things that kind of touch the need, but don't actually really get to it. And I've caught myself in this. The finger's pointed firmly at me, but here's been one of my internal dialogues. When I feel prompted to think of you, I'm going to operate on the assumption that maybe God has prompted me to do that. If I respond to that with a text message saying, hey, how are you doing? To what degree am I really living into what God is inviting me to? Or is it this cheap substitute? Now, I've been working on just getting better I did it just this week. I called this friend in Portland who I usually stay with in October, and I don't get to go this year, and I've been thinking about him, and I just called him, and I literally started the conversation. Hey, John, this is Adam. Hey, if you only have 5 minutes, that's okay, but I was just thinking about you, and I just wanted to see how you're doing. What if that's fundamentally a different kind of relational interaction than a text that says, hey, how you doing? Lexi applied this week. We were having this conversation as a staff, and she said there's this friend that she knows isn't doing well, and she said, my whole life I would have just texted and said, how you doing? And because of the conversations we've been having, she called her, and at hello, her friend started to cry. Would she have cried via text message? Of course she wouldn't. Would she have been real? I don't think so. What if we've got to take seriously some of the warnings that if we're not careful, some of our digital platforms, and I'm not trying to be a moralist that says there's no good to them, but what if the danger is they are the equivalent of the McDonald's drive-thru, that they're not actually meeting the need, but they're meeting it enough that you don't actually go really meet the real need? Remember, one of the things Cal Newport says is if it's true that digital platforms don't make for fulfilling relationship, then one of the real downsides of this is you can't manage as many meaningful relationships. So I get it. There's lots of tension and trouble and difficulty here. But what if, and this is, I guess, my question for you, what if we would all do well to go, to what degree is my body telling me it's hungry for connection, but I'm offering cheap substitutes to appease that need and therefore never reaching out to the real thing? And what if part of the real opportunity with what it means to be the church right now is to really take longer looks at what does it mean to be a Christ follower, and what does it mean to live in community? And what if we don't always have to have these grand Bible studies, but just being together is itself healing and transformative? I'd like to pray for you, and we'll finish with the song. God, Lord, I just think of how this applies. Just, if you're 16, this applies way differently than if you're 56. And I'm trusting, Lord, that to whatever degree there's truth for someone in this morning, that you would help them to nuance it to their age and stage. And some of us remember a day when we didn't have an iPhone in our back pocket, and some of us can't imagine a world without that. And God, that this wouldn't be about moralistic conclusions about good or bad or right and wrong as it relates to technology, but that you'd help us, lead us into those deeper needs and desires. God, Thinking of parents and how much energy it takes to navigate. How do we help our kids with their devices? And how do we recognize that it's a different day than the one we grew up in? And how do we recognize that unhealthy themes? Thinking of students, Lord, and the opportunity that comes from connection through those, and the opportunity for pain and just unhealthy things. God, we are all prone to being invited by you to meet an appetite in a good way and to fulfilling it in really unhealthy ways. And so, Lord, we're trusting that life's not any more difficult for us today in 2020 as it was in every other season of life, that might be different challenges, but not easier, not harder, just challenges. And Lord, we wouldn't be in this room if there wasn't this desire to be whole, to be healthy, to rise above what's normal and find you in the meaning of our days. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.